I still hear my father's voice ringing in my ears, sharp and dismissive, saying, "Your sister is successful and responsible, unlike you. She doesn't need help." That single sentence split my life into a before and an after, because what happened next forced me to make a choice that still keeps me awake at night. I need to know, honestly, if you were in my place. Would you have done the same thing I did, or would you have just walked away and let everything burn? Because at that moment, standing in his living room with my hands clenched so tight my nails dug into my palms, I felt like I had already lost something I could never get back. Let me ask you this right now, before I take you back to the beginning. Was I wrong for wanting to finally prove my worth, when my own father had already decided I was a lost cause? Or was I wrong for what I eventually did because of that judgment? Tell me, truly, because I've replayed this story 1,000 times in my head, and I still don't know where the line should have been. Growing up, it was always the three of us under one roof. My father, my older sister, and me. My mother passed away when I was young, so my memories of her are more like faded photographs than real moments. After she was gone, the house felt quieter, heavier, like every sound echoed a little too long. My father did his best, or at least that's what I used to tell myself. He worked long hours, came home tired, and expected things to just work. My sister, being 5 years older than me, stepped naturally into a role that felt almost parental. She was organized, disciplined, the kind of kid teachers loved. Straight A's, student council, debate club, scholarships. She didn't just make my father proud, she made him comfortable. She was predictable in the best way. Then there was me. I wasn't stupid, but I wasn't exceptional either. I struggled to focus, to care about things that didn't light some kind of fire in me. I loved art, music, and ideas that didn't come with clear instructions or guaranteed outcomes. To my father, that translated into irresponsible. To my sister, it translated into, "You'll figure it out someday," which sounded supportive, but always carried this undertone of doubt. Every family dinner felt like a comparison I never agreed to enter, but somehow always lost. Your sister got another award today. Your sister already has her future planned. Why can't you be more like her? I tried. God, I really tried. In high school, I pushed myself into classes I hated just to prove I could handle them. I joined clubs I didn't care about, stayed up late forcing myself to study material that felt like it was written in another language. When I did well, it was expected. When I didn't, it was proof. Proof that my father's low expectations were justified. Proof that I was, somehow, the problem child, even though I never got into trouble, never drank, never partied, never caused scenes. My crime was simply not being her. After graduation, my sister went off to a prestigious university on a partial scholarship. My father helped cover the rest without hesitation. I remember watching them go over paperwork at the kitchen table. My father's face calm, focused, almost proud. When it was my turn to talk about my plans, I said I wanted to take a gap year, work, maybe build a portfolio, figure out what I actually wanted before committing to debt and a degree I might hate. The room went cold. My father didn't yell. He didn't need to. He just looked at me and said, "That's not a plan. That's an excuse." I moved out shortly after that. Not because he kicked me out, but because living there felt like slowly suffocating. I found a small, cramped apartment, worked odd jobs, freelanced when I could, and tried to build something that felt like mine. It wasn't glamorous. There were months I barely scraped by. Months where I skipped meals without telling anyone. But there was also a sense of freedom I'd never known before. For the first time, my failures were my own, not a comparison point. Years passed like that. My sister graduated with honors, landed a solid corporate job, and quickly climbed the ladder. She bought a car, then a condo. Family gatherings became showcases of her success. My father would introduce her to friends with pride, listing her accomplishments like bullet points. When he introduced me, it was always vague. "This is my son. He's doing his own thing." I could hear the unspoken words hanging in the air. Despite everything, I didn't hate my sister. That's the part people often get wrong. I envied her, yes, and sometimes resented how easy things seemed for her. But I also loved her. She was kind in her own way, though sometimes oblivious to how her success cast a shadow over me. She'd offer advice that felt more like instructions, solutions that assumed I just hadn't tried hard enough. Still, when things got really bad for me financially, she was the one who'd slip me some money and say, "Don't tell Dad. He'll just make it a thing." The moment that changed everything came when my father fell ill. Nothing dramatic at first. Just small health issues that slowly piled up. Doctor visits became more frequent, medications more complex. My sister took charge immediately. She handled appointments, insurance, logistics. It made sense. She lived closer, had a stable schedule, and my father trusted her. I offered to help, to contribute financially where I could, but it was always waved off. "Your sister has it covered," he'd say. "Focus on getting your life together." Then came the day my father needed surgery. It wasn't life-threatening, but it was serious enough to require weeks of recovery. I remember standing in the hospital room after the doctor left, the air smelling like disinfectant machines, humming softly in the background. My sister was flipping through paperwork, calm and efficient. I asked my father, quietly, if there was anything specific he needed from me. He didn't even look up. That's when he said it. "Your sister is successful and responsible, unlike you. She doesn't need help." I felt something crack inside me. Not shatter, not explode. Just a clean, sharp break. I nodded, swallowed whatever response was clawing its way up my throat, and left the room. In the hallway, others call me, I leaned against the wall and stared at the floor, feeling like a child again, dismissed and minimized. I told myself it didn't matter, that I was used to this. But that night, lying awake in my apartment, those words replayed over and over, until they started to feel like a verdict on my entire existence. A week later, my sister called me. She sounded tired, stressed in a way I hadn't heard before. She told me managing everything alone was harder than she'd expected. Her job was demanding more hours, and the hospital bills were piling up faster than anticipated. I offered, again, to help financially. This time, she hesitated. "I don't know how Dad would feel about that," she said. That hesitation hurt more than an outright no. That's when I made a decision I hadn't planned. A decision born out of equal parts anger and desperation. I decided that if my father was never going to see me as capable, then I would prove it in the only way he seemed to understand money and responsibility. I took on more work than I could reasonably handle. Late nights, early mornings, projects I wasn't confident I could pull off. I pushed myself to the brink, driven by this need to finally be undeniable. It worked, at least on paper. Within months, I landed a major client that paid more than anything I'd done before. For the first time, my bank account didn't feel like a ticking time bomb. I started quietly paying off some of my father's medical bills anonymously, routing the payments through a third party so it wouldn't trace back to me. I told myself I wasn't doing it for validation, but that was a lie. Every confirmation email felt like a small, silent victory. Proof that I wasn't useless. Proof that I could carry weight. What I didn't anticipate was how quickly secrets grow teeth. My sister eventually noticed discrepancies in the bills, payments that didn't match her records. She confronted the hospital, then confronted my father. He was confused, suspicious even. When she called me, her voice was sharp, demanding answers. I panicked. I told her the truth, or at least part of it. I told her I'd been helping, that I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. There was a long silence on the line. When she finally spoke, she said, "You should have told me." I tried, I said, and meant more than just that moment. She promised not to tell our father, at least not yet. But the dynamic shifted. Suddenly, she looked at me differently. Less like a screw-up, more like an unknown variable. I thought that was progress. I thought things were finally changing. Then my father called me over one evening, asking to talk. His voice was stiff, formal, the way it used to get when he was disappointed. I sat across from him in the same living room, where I'd felt invisible so many times before. He asked me directly if I'd been paying his bills. I admitted it. I explained why. I told him I just wanted to help. He didn't thank me. He didn't even acknowledge the effort. Instead, he frowned and said, I'd overstepped, that I was trying to prove something that didn't need proving. He said my sister had things under control, and that my involvement only complicated matters. In that moment, I realized something devastating. No matter what I did, it would never be enough in his eyes. That realization is where I'll pause this part of the story. Because what I did next changed everything. Not just between me and my father, but between me and my sister too. Before I tell you how far I went and what it cost all of us, I want you to sit with this. If you were constantly compared, constantly dismissed, and finally found a way to prove your worth, only to be told it didn't matter, what would you do next? Would you keep trying, or would you stop playing by their rules altogether? Part 2 is where everything comes crashing down. What I did after that conversation with my father is something I've gone back and forth on 100 times, because once you realize that no amount of effort will ever change how someone sees you, there are really only two options left. You either accept that role forever, or you tear the whole illusion apart and force the truth into the open, no matter how ugly it gets. And before I continue, I need to ask you again, because this is where the line gets blurry. If you knew that staying quiet meant being erased, but speaking up meant hurting the people you love, which choice would you make? After my father told me I'd overstepped, I drove home in complete silence. No music, no calls, nothing. Just the sound of the road and my own thoughts spiraling. I kept replaying his words, not just from that night, but from my entire life. Successful, responsible, unlike you. It finally hit me that in his mind, my sister wasn't just better at life than me. She was safer. She was predictable. She fit neatly into the world he understood. I didn't. And instead of trying to understand me, he decided to write me off. For a few weeks after that, I pulled back. I stopped paying the bills. I stopped checking in. I told myself that if my help was unwanted, then fine, I'd keep my distance. My sister noticed immediately. She called me, asking why I'd gone quiet. I told her the truth. I said I was tired. Tired of being treated like a liability instead of a son. She sighed and said, "You know how Dad is." And that sentence, meant to smooth things over, did the exact opposite. Because suddenly I realized that, "Ho, Dad is," had become an excuse everyone used, including her, to avoid holding him accountable. Things started to unravel faster than I expected. My sister's workload increased even more. My father's recovery wasn't as smooth as the doctors predicted. Complications popped up, nothing fatal, but enough to require more care, more appointments, more money. I stayed out of it, or at least tried to. But guilt is a stubborn thing. Every time my phone buzzed, part of me hoped it was my father finally acknowledging me, finally saying he needed me. That call never came. Instead, I got a call from my sister late one night, her voice shaking. She told me she couldn't do it anymore, that she was drowning, that her job was on the line, her savings were disappearing, and she was terrified of letting our father down. For the first time in my life, she sounded human, not like the untouchable golden child, but like a scared daughter who didn't know how to hold everything together. I went over to her place that night. We sat on her couch, surrounded by neat furniture and framed certificates that suddenly felt more like cages than trophies. She broke down crying, saying she felt trapped by the role she'd been given. The responsible one, the dependable one, the one who never failed. And that's when it hit me that, while I'd been suffocating under low expectations, she'd been suffocating under impossibly high ones. We talked for hours. Really talked, not the polite surface, level conversations we'd always had. She admitted she resented me sometimes, not because I failed, but because I was allowed to fail. Because no one expected perfection from me. I admitted I'd spent years resenting her for being loved so easily. By the end of the night, we reached an unspoken agreement. Things had to change. Not quietly. Not carefully. Openly. We decided to tell our father everything. About the bills. About the pressure. About how his favoritism, whether intentional or not, had damaged both of us in different ways. I was terrified. Confrontation with him had never gone well for me. But I also knew that if I didn't do this now, I'd spend the rest of my life swallowing resentment and pretending it didn't hurt. The next evening, we sat across from him together. Same living room. Same heavy air. My sister spoke first, explaining how overwhelmed she was, how she couldn't carry everything alone anymore. My father looked genuinely surprised, even offended, he said. He thought she was handling it just fine. Then it was my turn. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought he might hear it. I told him how his words had affected me. How being constantly compared made me feel invisible. How being told I was irresponsible became a self-fulfilling prophecy, because no one trusted me with responsibility in the first place. I told him about the bills I'd paid, not to brag, but to show him that I was capable, that I always had been. His reaction wasn't what either of us expected. He didn't yell. He didn't argue. He laughed. Not loudly, not cruelly, but dismissively. He said we were being dramatic, that siblings always fight, that he'd done his best as a single parent, and that we should be grateful. He said life wasn't fair, and that some people just needed more guidance than others. He looked at me when he said that. Something inside me snapped, not in a violent way, but in a quiet, final way. I realized that this wasn't about misunderstanding. It wasn't about communication. It was about control. As long as he defined us by his narrative, he stayed comfortable. Admitting he was wrong would mean confronting years of mistakes. And he wasn't willing to do that. So, I did something drastic. Something I'd been avoiding, even thinking about. I told him I was done protecting his image. I told him that if he couldn't see me as his son, then I'd stop acting like one in the way he expected. I said I would no longer contribute financially or emotionally unless I was treated with basic respect. The room went dead silent. My sister looked at me like I'd just detonated a bomb. My father's face hardened. He told me not to threaten him in his own house. I told him it wasn't a threat. It was a boundary. A word I'd learned in therapy. A word he clearly hated. He said, if I walked away now, I shouldn't bother coming back. And for the first time in my life, I didn't back down. I stood up, told my sister I loved her, and left. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest of my life. I questioned everything. I wondered if I'd gone too far, if I'd been selfish, if I'd abandoned my family when they needed me most. My sister called me often, torn between loyalty to our father and relief at no longer being alone in her resentment. My father didn't call at all. Then, unexpectedly, things started to crumble for him, without me quietly stepping in. Without my sister being able to cover everything alone, the cracks became visible. Bills went unpaid. Appointments were missed. Extended family started asking questions. The image of the perfectly managed situation fell apart. And for the first time, people saw the reality we'd been living. About 2 months after our confrontation, I got a call from my father. His voice was weaker, not just physically, but emotionally. He asked me to come over. No apology, no explanation, just a request. I debated for hours before agreeing. When I arrived, he looked smaller somehow, older. The house felt emptier. He told me he needed help. Just like that. The words I'd waited my whole life to hear. But instead of relief, I felt a strange sadness. Because needing help wasn't the same as acknowledging harm. I asked him if he understood why I'd walked away. He avoided the question. Said we could talk about that later. I realized then that later might never come. I agreed to help, but on my terms. Shared responsibility, transparency, respect. He didn't like it, but he didn't have much choice. My sister and I restructured everything together. We split duties. We supported each other. And slowly, the weight shifted. Not because our father changed, but because we did. The real turning point came when extended family gathered for a holiday dinner. For years, I'd sat quietly while my sister was praised and I was overlooked. This time, when someone commented on how lucky my father was to have such a responsible daughter, my sister corrected them. She said, "Actually, we're both taking care of things now." My father said nothing. But he didn't contradict her either. That moment, small as it seems, meant more to me than any apology could have. It was acknowledgement, even if it came indirectly. over time, my relationship with my father settled into something neutral. Not warm, not close, but honest enough to function. He never fully admitted his favoritism. He never said he was wrong. But he stopped saying I was irresponsible. And sometimes, silence is the closest thing to accountability you're going to get. Looking back now, I don't see myself as the failure I once thought I was. I see a kid who grew up in the shadow of expectations that didn't fit him, who survived by carving his own path, even when it hurt. I see a sister who was burdened by praise just as much as I was burdened by criticism. And I see a father who did what he knew how to do, even when it wasn't enough. So, was I wrong? Was I wrong for stepping back, for forcing the truth into the open, for letting things fall apart so they could be rebuilt honestly? Or was that the only way things could ever change? I still don't have a clear answer. What I do know is this: sometimes being the less successful one gives you the freedom to redefine success entirely. If you made it this far, thank you for listening to my story. If you were on my side, like this video. If you think I went too far, tell me why in the comments. Subscribe for more stories like this, because, trust me, life has no shortage of complicated messes like this one. And I'll see you all in the next story.